Welcome to this breakaway crochet tutorial. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use my breakaway crochet techniques to work these handy granny mittens. As you can see, these mittens are made up of 3 round granny squares, and the squares are attached to each other with a solid join. At first glance, it looks like the squares were made individually and then joined together later. But since this is a breakaway crochet project, we're going to work the squares in one continuous flow with no sewing and absolutely no yarn tails to weave in. This tutorial accompanies the free written instructions that you can download from my Ravelry store. And I hope this video clears up anything that might not seem clear to you from reading the instructions alone. You can find the link for the pattern in the description. Once you have downloaded the pattern, you will need to decide what size of mitten you would like to make. You have a choice of 4 sizes, and you choose the size according to the length of the intended wearer's hand. To measure hand length, go from the bottom of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. Then refer to the chart in the written instructions to determine the size you should make. Once you know the mitten size, you can then organize what yarn and hook size to use. The yarn and hook size matter because the instructions are exactly the same for all 4 sizes, and the only way to modify the size of the mittens is by adjusting the gauge. That means to get a smaller size, you will use a smaller hook and thinner yarn, and a larger hook and thicker yarn to get a larger size. To make sure your mittens turn out to be the right size, make a test granny square using the specified hook and yarn. The instructions for making the test square are also in the written pattern, but it's basically a 3 round granny square with 2 chains in each corner and with no chains between the granny clusters on each side. Once you've made your test square, you now need to measure your square diagonally and check that it matches the measurements given in the chart. If it's too small, then go up in hook size. If it's too big, then go down in hook size. And remember to use the new hook size for your project. And finally, just a few words about what I'm going to show you in this tutorial. Because of the unusual arrangement of the granny squares, there are slight variations in the instructions for each square. So I will be going through each square one by one in order to highlight any special techniques as they come to hand. So let's get started with the first square, which is actually what I'm calling a 3/4 square, which sits just underneath the thumb. And also because this is only kind of a partial square, because it sits on the edge, we will be working back and forth in 3 rows to work this 3/4 square. So let's start with a floating double crochet. To do a floating double crochet, yarn over and then make a floating ring. To make a floating ring, do another yarn over and pinch the yarn close to the hook. Do another yarn over and draw that new yarn in with what you're already pinching. Yarn over and pull through the 2 loops you're pinching. And these 2 loops here are the floating ring. They replace the usual chain 4 slip stitch center ring you would normally do. I'm going to work all the stitches into this floating ring as a center ring for this little square. Alright, let's continue now with the double crochet part by using the loops that are already on the hook. Finish the double crochet, just do yarn over, pull through 2 twice. And there is our floating double crochet, which is the first stitch of the first row. Continue with 3 more double crochets into the floating ring. Chain 2, do 3 more double crochets into the floating ring. Chain 2, and finally 4 more double crochets into the center floating ring. There, that's row 1 done. Continue with chain 3 and turn, which is very unusual for breakaway projects. But this is a special case where we've got this square that has to be worked in rows. Okay, so that chain 3 counts as a double crochet. Work 3 more double crochets into the same stitch. And without any chains at all, we're going to make our way to the next corner. Now this will be a typical granny corner where we put a granny cluster, which is just 3 double crochets in a row in the same place. Chain 2 and another granny cluster in the same space. Repeat that in the next space with the granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster. And now skip 3 stitches and do 4 double crochets into that last stitch. There we go. Chain 3 for the start of row 3, and turn. And we're only going to work this side of the 3/4 square, but we begin with, again, with 3 double crochets in the same stitch, the granny cluster in the next space, and a granny cluster in the next space. So even though this is a corner, we are not going to work it all the way, as we've reached the breakaway point of this 3/4 square. There we go. And you can see I'm calling it a 3/4 square because we've got 3 sides and this 4th bit is left out. So now that we are at the breakaway point for this square, we are going to move on and add in our next square, which sits right next door here. And to start this square and most of the other squares, I've got an abbreviation called WFR. That stands for Work First Rounds, which just means to work round 1 and round 2. And I've abbreviated that just to use as a shortcut. You don't need to explain that every time we start a new square, if it's the same for every square. But I'll go through how to do that now, and just remember to do that for any other square that requires a WFR. Okay, so the first thing to do is to get a stitch marker, and we need to hold the loop that is on the hook, because we're going to drop that off in a minute and we don't want that to unravel. Okay, so let's start with our working the first rounds. Do 5 yarn overs. 2, 3, 4, 5. Make a floating ring. Just yarn over, pinch, yarn over, pinch, yarn over, pull through 2, just like we did before. So there's our floating ring for our new square. Square A, I should say. We should need to keep track of that. Okay. Continue with the first stitch of round 1, which is a double crochet. We only need these first 3 stitches here to go through. So pull through 2, pull through 2, and there is our double crochet and floating ring for square A. Now, all these extra loops on the hook, we don't need those right now, so let's get rid of them. So just pull the hook out, let everything go, and get your hook back into the working loop. We can just let all that drop, and we're going to use this slack thread a little bit later on. That's what we use for the yarn overs for the first stitch of each round. That comes later. Alright, so from now on, this is a pretty typical first round of a granny square. Let's continue with 2 more double crochets into the floating ring. Chain 2, and then continue with a granny cluster, chain 2, all the way around until we get all 4 granny clusters. There we are. And let's close this first round with a chain 1 and a single crochet into the next stitch. And what I'm counting as the next stitch is actually this little loop here and the slack thread. So if you kind of pull on that little loop underneath here, it's actually, if you pull on that, you'll see that it pulls on the slack thread, so you know that that's the right loop to go through. So go through that, go under the slack thread, and work a single crochet. And I kind of loosened that up, so I'll just tug on that a little bit to tighten it up. So there, we've got a replacement for a chain 2 space by doing that. The single crochet means that the hook is in the middle of the corner, which is where we want to be. Alright, let's go on to round 2. And this starts with what I call a load double crochet. For a load double crochet, remove the hook from the working loop, find your slack yarn, and we're going to put 2 yarn overs using the slack yarn. So just go underneath and come around, underneath, come around. There's our 2 yarn overs, and come back into the working loop. And we're only going to use just enough yarn to make these yarn overs. We still need a little bit more for the next round. So that should be, you should see some extra yarn there, that's okay. Okay, so let's finish the double crochet by pulling through those 2 loops twice. And that's our load double crochet. And continue with 2 more double crochets in the same space. And you can see we're only working half of this corner in the beginning. We'll catch that up at the end as we come around. Continue with our granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster in each corner space. There we go, done those 3 corners, and coming back to the original corner, work 1 more granny cluster in that space, and we're going to close it off the same way we did round 1 with a chain and a single crochet in that next stitch there. And that's round 2 done, looking just like a normal granny square. And just remember again that these first 2 rounds, pretty much every square will do that, so I'm not going to show you that anymore. It just gets a bit redundant. Just rewind if you need a review. Okay, so instead it's round 3 that is slightly different for each square, so that's what I'm going to pay attention to the most. in this case, we're working on this square here, that's square A. We are about to do a special stitch here called a restore double crochet. I'll show you that in just a sec. And then we're going to continue working this side, but at the same time we are going to be joining in to this side of the 3/4 square. So I'll go through that now, and also make sure you don't have your 3/4 square turned around the wrong way. Keep track of that last side we worked there. That's what we're going over. Okay, so let's do this restore double crochet to start this side here and the joining. And just to get you oriented with how you should be holding your work, this is the square we're working on. Of course, the 3/4 square here with the last side or edge we worked along the top here. So that's how you should be holding things. And let's make that again, that restore double crochet, which is the first stitch of this side. So what you do, take the hook out of the working loop. Let's go through the marked loop, let's remove this marked loop. When you get good, you can remove the marker before you put the hook in. Okay. Use the slack yarn to make a yarn over, and then put the hook back into the working loop. There we go. Got 3 loops on the hook. Yarn over, pull through 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. And there is our restore double crochet, which automatically joins this first stitch here to this stitch here on the 3/4 square. Okay, so now we're going to continue working along this edge, but joining to the stitches that are already here on this edge. We do that with grab stitches, and in this case a grab double crochet. And the point here is to make sure we're lining up the proper stitch that goes here with its neighbor over here. In this case it's this second stitch. So we count back 1, 2, 3 to find that first stitch, dip the hook back and go through just the back loop and swing it up like that. So we've grabbed our stitch. Now let's come back to square A and work pretty much a double crochet in that same space. Yarn over, pull through 2, and yarn over, pull through 3 for a grab stitch because we're catching in that extra loop. So let's join that stitch and that stitch. For the rest of this edge, we just need to think about where the next loop is behind the hook, which is just there. Again, grab it and work another grab double crochet in the same space. That's joined the first granny cluster. Now we have a grab granny cluster working into the next space. Again, now that we've started the edge, we can just go into that next back loop and work the first stitch of a grab granny cluster. Here's the second stitch into the same space. Oops. And the third, and remember, we're always looking behind. That's what I mean by behind the hook. Going backwards to a previous stitch, grabbing the back loop, and working our grab double crochet. Almost done. Let's do one more grab granny cluster in the next space. Let's going into the next stitch. There we go, 1, here's 2, and 1 more. There we go. We're almost through with this side. As you know, we have a chain 2 in every corner. The first of the chains grabs on to the 3/4 square. So let's do a grab chain stitch. That just means find the next back loop, go through, and then just pull through both loops. There's a grab chain. So that's that side done. The first stitch of the chain 2 space done. The second chain is not joined, so just do a normal chain, a normal granny cluster in the same space, and just continue with these next 2 sides of the square. We've got, of course, the granny cluster, a corner there with the granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster here, and end the last corner with just a granny cluster. I'll go ahead and work that for you now. There we go, and I'll just flip this around this way as I talk about the next square. But before we go on, it's a good idea to label each square so that I can refer to them by letter. I've just got a little alphabet bead that I put on a stitch marker, and just label that square A. There we go. Alright, so now that we are at the breakaway point for square A, we come along and we do square B, which sits just next door here. And the good news is it's worked exactly the same way as square A. So I don't think I need to show you that again. Again, just rewind if you need to know how to do square B. It's just like square A. I'll go ahead and slot that in for you now. There we go, square B done. And now for square C, which is slightly different because it sits right here at the tip of the mitten, and I wanted the very tip up here to be slightly rounded. So it's really just the corner, this corner here, which is slightly different. So I just wanted to highlight that. But in the meantime, again, you start with round 1, just like we normally do. And round 2 is pretty much the same until we get to this 3rd corner. So go ahead with 2 more double crochets here, our granny corner here, normal granny corner here, and then I'll show you what to do in this corner here. And the good news is it's really no big deal. In this 3rd corner, just work 6 double crochets without any chains at all between the stitches. And finish it off in the normal way. You've just got another granny cluster in the remaining space. And of course the chain 1 single crochet into the next stitch. Ready now for round 3, which again starts with a restore double crochet. We use our slack yarn to make a yarn over that first double crochet into that space, and we do our grab stitches along this edge here. So 2 more grab double crochets here, grab granny cluster, grab granny cluster, and a grab chain to join this side up to that one. Continue with a chain 1, another granny cluster in this space, granny cluster, granny corner, and granny cluster. And I'll pause when I get to this section here where we've done the 6 double crochets in this corner. There we are, and it's really not too big of a deal to work this corner. What we're doing is putting a granny cluster between every second stitch. So let's do that first granny cluster by skipping these 2 stitches here and going right in between stitches there. And all 3, of course, go into that same space between the stitch. There you go. Skip 2 more and do the same thing. Now there's that our rounded corner for square C. Finish up with another granny cluster, chain 1, and then there's something slightly different to do when we get to the end. So I'll go ahead and finish that up. So as you can see, we've not stopped here and gone on. Square C is kind of our turnaround point. That's why we've gone all the way around. And now that we're in the final corner, we're going to start heading back down the other direction, and we're going to finish off square B, square A, and work a little bit more on the 3/4 square. So the procedure here is pretty straightforward. After the final granny cluster, in that space, it's chain 1, and now we do a single crochet between squares. And to do that, I like to see this kind of little horizontal thread there. I like to start off by going through there. It can be a little bit stubborn. There we go. And then find a horizontal thread at the back. So you're going through 2 threads. There we go. And do a single crochet. And that counts as a chain 2 space by doing that. Alright, now the rest is pretty straightforward. Just going to continue on with another chain 1, granny cluster into the next 3 spaces. And then again the chain 1, single crochet between, chain 1, granny cluster, granny cluster, granny cluster, chain 1, single crochet, chain 1. And when we get back to the 3/4 square, again we're going to do granny cluster in the first 3 spaces and end with a chain 1. And now that we are at the end of this sort of a row, it's an exciting time because now it's time to do the thumb. And before we start, I just thought I'd give a quick overview of the process to hopefully help you understand how it's worked. So we actually have come along here, and this is the point where we've stopped. And we're going to start the thumb again with a whole bunch of yarn overs and a floating ring, which will sit right here at the very tip of the thumb. So this is going to be round 1 of the thumb, and then we come along and do other rounds in granny stitch. Alright, and when we get to the last round of the thumb, we're doing our grab stitches, and those are grabbed into that last sort of side we worked on the 3/4 square. So by the time we get to the thumb, we work that all the way around, and there'll be a bit here that's not joined for now. And that will be the thumb completely worked. So let's get going. Remember, we need the stitch marker to hold our last stitch. So we're going to be dropping that off like the others. And we're going to do, to start the thumb, 10 yarn overs. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and now a floating ring. And the first double crochet of that little circle that sits at the tip of the thumb. So pull through 2 twice. Again, let's get rid of all this extra yarn and that loop. We don't need that for now. And come back to the working loop. Continue with 11 more double crochets into a floating ring. So that's the equivalent of 12 double crochets in our little circle, and close that off with a slip stitch. Round 2 of the thumb starts with a load double crochet. Again, we've got a whole lot of yarn left over in our slack yarn. Just take what we need for this double crochet and finish it off. Continue with 2 more double crochets in the same space, or stitch I should say. And for the rest of this round, skip 2 and work a granny cluster into the next stitch. You do that until we've got all 4 granny clusters for this round. You see it's starting to cup as we only have the 4 granny clusters. And let's close that with a slip stitch like we've been doing before in that little loop there and underneath the slack yarn to close off that round. And there's round 2 done. Round 3 is very similar. Start with a load double crochet, 2 double crochets into the same space to make a granny cluster, and then go around in the next 3 spaces working a granny cluster in each of those spaces. And again, close with a slip stitch. Round 4 is just like round 3. And now, round 5, where things get interesting. As we work round 5 of the thumb, we are going to be joining to that last edge we worked on the 3/4 square. Alright, and I'll just go through that now. Actually, I'll just review how to do a restore double crochet, which is how we start this whole thing off. And again, I'll take the stitch marker out first. It's actually probably easier. Okay. We've got our slack yarn between the 2 elements, and then back into the working loop. Okay, so let's finish that off by doing the pull throughs, and we've joined the first stitch of this granny cluster with actually the chain, that extra chain we did there. Okay, so that's why there was an extra chain. Okay, so to continue, as before, we look for the 3rd stitch behind the hook. 1, 2, 3. So joining this stitch here to the next stitch we make on the thumb, back loop, do a grab double crochet into the same space. Look for the next one, do another grab double crochet, and actually I'd like you to do 1 more in this space. So you've actually got 4 grab double crochets in that space. That's on purpose. Moving along, we've got a granny cluster here that will be joined to the one we're making in the next space. So just find the next stitch behind the hook, come to the next space, and work our next granny cluster. It's 1, here's 2, and 3. We've got the next granny cluster in the next space on the thumb. So 1, 2, 3. And because the beginning had 4 double crochets in that space, we're going to make things symmetrical here and do a 4th double crochet into this space. So just go into the next loop, put 1 more double crochet, or grab double crochet I should say. There we go. So that's 4, 3, 4. Okay, now we're going to continue. We're not done with round 5 of the thumb. We're going to continue without joining. So that means do another chain stitch, find that last space of the thumb, do a granny cluster in there without any joining, chain 1, and now we're going to do our slip stitch between the thumb and the 3/4 square. So just think about, I'm going to close the thumb and there is the intersection, so just go through, do a single crochet, and that's the thumb done. Pretty cool. Okay, let's finish off now with, let's finish off the last edge of the 3/4 square. So continue with chain 1 and a granny cluster in the next 2 spaces, and finally skip 3 stitches and work 4 double crochets in the last stitch, which is actually that turning chain. Get our stitch marker in, and there we have it. Thumb sits over the 3/4 square, and now we're ready to kind of start with the next row of squares on top, but first we're going to do our other special little square. It's a half square, I'm calling it, really a triangle, but it's going to sit right here, and again that's worked in rows because we're only going halfway. So let's get started with the half square. Start with a bunch of yarn overs again. This time we need 6. And now the floating ring. Double crochet with the yarn over, pull through 2 twice. And release the extra loops. Continue with 3 more double crochets into the floating ring, chain 2, and 4 more double crochets into this floating ring. That's row 1 done. For row 2, chain 3 and turn. Again, we've got 3 double crochets into the same stitch, Go straight to this next corner and do a granny corner. And straight to the last stitch and work. This time just put, it's kind of hard to see where to go in there, just put 3 double crochets. Once I can find my spot, there we go. 3 double crochets. And here's something a little bit unusual. We're going to now use the slack yarn to make a couple of chains here. So what I mean is, go through the same place where you've been working those double crochets, come up and grab the slack yarn and draw through a loop, and use the slack yarn to make a couple of chain stitches through that loop. 1 and 2. It's a little bit awkward, but this is the only time you have to do it, so that's alright. Alright, we're through with the slack yarn, come back to the main yarn and pull through 2. I've done that to raise the slack yarn up to the same level that we need here. Okay, so that's round 2 of our half square done. Now, we'll continue row 3 with a restore double crochet. And turn. Work 3 more double crochets, into the same stitch. There you go, so that's the equivalent of 4 double crochets. Granny cluster in the next space, and just the 1 granny cluster in the corner space. That's the breakaway point. Then our stitch marker, and there we go. The next square slots in here, square D. So again, we start with the work to the first 2 rounds, and we're going to be joining this side to this one. So you would begin with a restore double crochet, 2 more grab double crochets into the same space, the same space here, grab granny cluster in this space, and a grab granny cluster in the 3rd space. I'll work to there and show you what happens next. So after this 3rd granny cluster, I've got to turn the corner and joining this side to this one. And because we're in the corner and need 2 chain stitches, but those 2 chain stitches are joined, let's do 2 grab chain stitches. So just grab the next 2 back loops and do our chain stitch. And continue along the next side, just going stitch by stitch, working that first grab granny in the same space, and a grab granny in the next 2 spaces. There we go. That's all 3 granny clusters that have been grabbed. And we end this side with a grab chain. Okay, so we're almost done. Square D here. What we need to do now is just continue the 3rd side without any joining with another chain, granny cluster in the same space, granny cluster, and then we're breaking away to the next square. Yeah, moving on to square E. And square E is pretty interesting because it slots and joins next to square D, but we also join that corner in with the unfinished bit of the thumb, and then this third side joins up with square A. So I know that sounds kind of complicated, but let's just go stitch by stitch. Alright, begin with, again, our first 2 rounds. Next, we're going to connect this side to side D. Again, that starts with a restore double crochet and 2 double crochets into the same space. Move on with a grab granny cluster in the next 2 spaces. And now it's time to move on, and we're going to be joining up this portion of the thumb. So I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So after these 3 joined granny clusters or grabbed granny clusters have been done, we've got one more chain, grab chain I should say. And before we go on, I would like you to do a slip stitch in this space of the 3/4 square. That just gives a nice square look to that corner. Alright, it just kind of adds to the neat appearance of the whole glove or mitten. So just do a slip stitch in that next space there. And now we're going to move on to that last edge of the thumb. What we have here now is a chain stitch to go into. So I do a grab chain. Let's grab this granny cluster into the same space as our last one on square D. Sorry, square E. Now just work those 3 stitches into that same space. So that's 2 granny clusters in that corner on square E, and we've joined that granny cluster on the thumb. Now looking back at the thumb, we've got one more chain. So let's do a grab chain. And again, before we move on, I'd like you to do a slip stitch again in that space on the 3/4 square. Just to, again, keep things looking kind of tidy. So just dip back and do a slip stitch. And now we're going to finish off this next side on square E and join to square A. And as we are going back here, remember when we came along here, we did a single crochet as we were going along. Well, when we do our grab stitches, we need to skip those single crochets and look for the first chain stitch to grab of the next square. So just make sure you're going into an actual chain stitch when you do a grab chain. Alright, and let's see if I can sort this out here now. Now as we go on, we are going to be joining this granny cluster into the same corner. So that's something a little bit different there too. So let's grab the next granny cluster, find the same corner we were going into before with that first double crochet, and do 2 more grab double crochets in that same space. So there we go, underneath the thumb. You've got these 3 granny clusters going into that same space on square E. Now, let's finish off square E with another grab granny cluster in the next space, another grab granny cluster in the next space, grab chain, and then work up the other side without any joining. Chain 1, granny cluster, granny cluster, granny cluster. And there we have our square E finished. Ready for our last square, and which will slot in here. And actually this square is a lot like square C. The only difference is an extra side where it's joined. So I'll go ahead and start just the first round. And remember, for round 2 on this special first round section, we do a load double crochet, 2 double crochets in the same space, granny corner, and we get to the 3rd space, that is 6 double crochets, and then end with a chain and single crochet in the first stitch. And for round 3 on square F, we've got a restore double crochet and 2 grab double crochets in the same space, a grab granny in the next space, and a grab granny in this space, and a grab chain. Again, I'd like you to do a slip stitch, again this time in the corner here of square A, before we move on, and then you will come find that first chain of square B to do a grab chain, and then you've got the second grab granny cluster in the corner and 2 more grabbed granny clusters in the next 2 spaces, chain 1, and again I'd like you to slip stitch into this space here. And now that we are right in the corner here, from now on the real magic happens, because as we come around this square F, we're going to continue joining to square C. And in fact, every time we make a new stitch along this edge, we will be joining along this edge. All right, so it's all just grab double crochets and grab chains all the way around. It sounds a bit complicated, but really you're just always grabbing the next stitch behind the hook. Alright, so just before we go on here, before we start this big long process, again I'd like you to do an extra slip stitch in square B. And now let's go on. So again, for every stitch we make on our unfinished square, we've got to grab into the stitch behind the hook. And this starts with, we've done 1 chain for this corner, we need the second chain. So let's find the next chain stitch on square C, do a grab chain, and we need our second granny square in this corner. So let's grab that one there on square C. 1, 2, 3. Okay, grab granny cluster in the next space. And again, you don't have to worry about where to grab into, it's just always behind the hook. And now, because we had that special 6 double crochet rounded corner, we do exactly like we did before, but we're just grabbing in. So grab the next stitch, and of the next 6 double crochets, let's do a grab granny cluster between the 2nd and 3rd stitch. Another grab granny cluster between the 4th and 5th stitch. Again, I just have to find the next stitch behind the hook and then find where the next granny cluster belongs and make that cluster. Okay, so that's getting the top of the mitten joined up. Let's keep going. We've got 2 more grab granny clusters here in square F. And when we get to that very last granny cluster on square F, remember we've got to close it. And again, we need a grab chain. And we'll do our single crochet between the 2 motifs, but we don't need to grab the single crochet. Let's just slot that in between the 2 squares. And then we go back to grabbing our stitches. So here we are ready to start, or actually finish, square E. But we need the 2nd chain for that corner. So do a grab chain again. We're looking for actually the first chain behind the hook when we're at an intersection like this. So do our grab chain, our grab granny into that next space. And really that is the gist of what to do. So we've joined up the tip of our mitten. Let's keep going. We're going to be finishing up this side of square E and D and our triangle. And as I've shown you, if you just look behind the hook for that next back loop behind the hook, you know where to grab into. So that just means finish off with a grab granny cluster in the next 2 spaces, grab chain, single crochet between, grab chain, grab granny into this space, this space, this space, grab chain, single crochet between, grab chain. I get back to our triangle. Again, it's a grab granny in the next 2 spaces. It's hard to see that space there. And then when you get to the end, find that last stitch and do 4 grab double crochets into that turning chain. So here I am doing those last 4 double crochets on our half square. Just put a stitch marker to hold things for the moment. And voila, that's our mitten all worked and joined in one hit. There we go. So of course the next step is to do the cuff, and that's very easy. I won't go through that because that's a very traditional way of doing a cuff, but it does start with a round of single crochet around the edge, and then you just turn it this way and work rows in single crochet in the back loop. Okay, sorry, just refer to the instructions for how to do that. So let me know if I went too fast on anything. I know there's a lot to comprehend when making something like this. It's a very unusual project. But the best place, probably other than on YouTube, is to join my Breakaway Crochet Chat and Support group on Facebook. Um, that's where you can actually, I'd love to see anything you actually make. You can share your projects. If you've got questions or just want to chat about breakaway crochet projects or the technique in general, then follow the link in the description, and I'd love to hear from you. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.